Alex!
Alex, halikod!
Picture this. A 21-year-old is down a set and down a break against a reigning Olympic champion. And somehow, in the space of 20 minutes, the gold medalist is the one who suddenly looks fragile. The crowd, which had been roaring with every point the Olympic champion won, falls into an uneasy silence. The momentum shifts so dramatically that it feels like the very air inside the stadium has changed. Then, less than a full day later, she walks back onto that same court and faces a woman who is hammering the ball harder and cleaner than almost anyone else in the draw. A woman who ends the first set having produced 15 more clean winners than she did. And she still loses the stat sheet completely, except she does not lose the match. Both times, she walks away with a win. And once you understand how she pulled it off, you will realize the entire narrative around this player has been wrong for years. Everyone keeps asking if Alex Eala can pull off one more storybook afternoon. That is the wrong question entirely. The real question, the one nobody has bothered to ask until now, is what happens when there is no miracle, when the fairy tale run refuses to show up, and she wins anyway. That question just got answered on a hard court in Washington, D.C. And the answer is loud enough that it is about to reshape how the tennis world talks about her. So stick around, because this is not really a story about tennis scorelines. It is a story about a young athlete who finally stopped needing flawless tennis to walk off a winner. It is a story about evolution, about patience, and about the quiet transformation of a player who was always talented but is now becoming something far more dangerous, a winner who doesn't need to be perfect to prevail. Let us rewind to a Tuesday afternoon, a first-round match that somehow drew a crowd far louder than first rounds usually get. The William H. G. Fitzgerald Tennis Center in Washington, D.C. was buzzing with an energy that felt more like a final than an opening match. Philippine flags dotted the stands, and the chants of Alex echoed through the corridors even before the players took the court. On the other side of the net stood Zheng Qinwen, an Olympic gold medalist, a former top 4 player in the world. Someone whose serve does not just win points, it deletes them before a rally even has the chance to begin. For the opening hour, that is precisely what unfolded. Ace after ace piled up, 14 of them by full time, a number that on its own should have settled the outcome. Eala managed 4 aces in the entire match. 4 against 14. In a sport where free points off the serve are practically oxygen, one player was breathing easy while the other was gasping for it. The statistics painted a grim picture. Zheng's first serve percentage hovered around 70%, and when she landed her first serve, she won over 80% of those points. Eala, by contrast, struggled to find her range, her first serve landing only 55% of the time, and even when it did, she was winning barely 60% of those points. On paper, this was a mismatch. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Eala dropped the first set 4-6, and in the second set, she fell behind a break early. The scoreboard read 1-2, and the momentum was entirely with the Chinese star. If you had followed Eala's career up to this point, you already knew the next scene by heart, because this is exactly where her matches used to fall apart. The brilliant flashes, the sudden collapse in the middle, the frustrating early exit that left you wondering what might have been. A set down and a breakdown against an in-form Olympic champion. This was always the point where the version of Eala from a year or two ago quietly faded from view. But this time, something was different. There was a calmness in her eyes, a stillness in her movements that hadn't been there before. This time, she did not fade. She broke straight back without flinching, without waiting for a lucky bounce or a gift from her opponent. She simply took the game in front of her. Then the next one. Then something happened that had commentators sounding almost stunned in real time. She reeled off 7 straight games. 7 against an Olympic gold medalist in a stadium that had shown up specifically to watch that same gold medalist play. Winning 7 consecutive games while trailing by a set and a break is not a hot streak. It looks more like a total systems failure. Except the system that broke down was not hers. It belonged to her opponent. Zheng was given every chance to fix things. She held serve multiple times. She had multiple opportunities to change her patterns, to hunt for a different target, to find some crack in the defense. She tried, and every single time Eala shut the door a little tighter. Not through some sudden discovery of extra pace on her groundstrokes, but through something much less glamorous and far more lethal. She refused to donate the point. She got one more ball back over the net, then another, defended corners of the court that should have been lost causes, and made her opponent hit the same difficult shot again and again until the margin for error evaporated and the errors started arriving on their own. The final set finished 6-1, a total reversal of the match that had begun. And walking off that court, something had shifted that had nothing to do with the scoreboard. The statistics from that match told a fascinating story. Zheng hit 14 aces, won 75% of her first serve points, and struck 28 winners. Eala, by comparison, had just 4 aces, won 62% of her first serve points, and hit 19 winners. And yet, Eala won the match. The difference came down to unforced errors. Zheng made 42 unforced errors, Eala made just 18. The Olympic champion had beaten herself, and Eala had simply stayed patient enough to let it happen. It was a masterclass in discipline, a lesson in the art of not beating yourself. And it sent a clear message to the rest of the tour. Eala was no longer a player who could be pressured into mistakes. She was a player who could absorb pressure and return it with interest. Here is where the story gets even stranger, because you would expect a performance like that to leave a player running on fumes. The kind of win that costs you the rest of the tournament. The emotional energy required to come back from a set and a breakdown against an Olympic champion is immense. The physical toll of a 3-set battle, especially one that lasted over 2 hours, should have left Eala exhausted. Instead, 24 hours later, Eala was right back out there against someone even more dangerous. Leylah Fernandez, the defending champion of the event, a former US Open finalist, and a player who only months earlier had beaten Eala so thoroughly in Stuttgart that it barely resembled a competitive match. 6-1, 6-4. That was not a close loss. Fernandez had solved her, knew exactly where the pressure points lived, and now stood across the net again, rested and confident, ready to repeat the lesson. The contrast between the two players was stark. Fernandez, the 7th seed and defending champion, had the experience of having won this very tournament the year before. She had beaten top seed Jessica Pegula en route to that title, proving she could handle the pressure of the big stage. She knew the court, knew the conditions, and had the confidence of a champion returning to familiar ground. Eala, by contrast, was playing in her first main draw at this tournament. She was coming off a physically and emotionally draining match. She had less than 24 hours to recover and prepare. On paper, everything pointed to a Fernandez victory. What happened next produced a number that should genuinely alarm you. The kind of statistic that typically ends careers rather than launches them. 10 winners against 25. Fernandez struck 2.5 times as many outright untouchable winners as Eala managed. She was playing the objectively better tennis, cleaner, sharper, more explosive. And Eala won in straight sets anyway. Stop and sit with that for a second, because on paper it should not be possible. A winner is not some fortunate mishit. It is a shot the opponent simply cannot get a racket on. Fernandez produced 15 more of those moments than Eala did. 15 instances of being flat out too good to touch. And she still lost the match. The real explanation is not sitting in the winners column at all. It is buried in the category nobody ever talks about, unforced errors. In the opening set alone, Eala committed 4 unforced errors. Fernandez committed 14. While Fernandez was busy painting lines and blasting winners, she was also giving away more than triple the free points. Eala was not trying to trade blow for blow. She was doing something quieter, more patient, and honestly more ruthless. She let her opponent beat herself. Eala claimed the first set 6-2, and the stadium erupted. The Philippine flags waved wildly, the chants grew louder, and for a moment it seemed like Eala might cruise through the match. But Fernandez was a defending champion for a reason. And just as the match seemed to settle into a rhythm, everything flipped. Fernandez found another gear, pushed her targets deeper, and ran off 5 straight games. 5 in a row. Suddenly Eala went from comfortably ahead to trailing 5-1 in the second set, one single game away from a deciding third set in swirling wind, less than a day removed from a grueling battle against an Olympic champion. This is exactly the scenario where fatigue is supposed to take over, where the legs get heavy, the mind goes quiet, and the tank simply runs dry. The crowd, which had been so energetic just moments before, fell silent. Fans exchanged worried glances. The momentum had shifted entirely. Instead, Eala won the next 5 games in a row right back, 6-5. It was a stunning reversal, a display of mental fortitude that left even the commentators struggling to find words. Fernandez held to force a tiebreak. If you assume the tension eased up at that point, it only intensified. A tiebreak against a defending champion, a crowd chanting her name, an entire stadium leaning forward at once. And this is where Eala delivered the coldest, most composed stretch of tennis in the whole match. She raced out to 5-1 as Fernandez cracked under the exact kind of pressure Eala had been absorbing all week long. Then to seal it, 2 consecutive forehand winners, the exact kind of shot you would have expected to come from the other side of the net just a day earlier. 7 points to 1. Match over. 10 winners to 25 on the day. And somehow, impossibly, the scoreboard still favored her. Now, line those two results up side by side, because that is when the real pattern finally comes into focus. Against Zheng, she was outgunned on serve, 14 aces to 4. Against Fernandez, she was outgunned on raw firepower, 10 winners to 25. Two completely different opponents, two entirely different ways to lose on paper, back-to-back days. And in both cases, she found a way through that had absolutely nothing to do with matching her opponent's biggest weapon. She wasn't trying to outserve the best server. She wasn't trying to out-hit the hardest hitter. She was playing a different game entirely, a game of patience, discipline, and mental toughness. And she was winning. To understand why this matters so much, you need to know who Eala actually is. Because the contrast is what makes all of this so remarkable. At just 21, she is already the highest-ranked player in the history of Philippine tennis. She trained at Rafael Nadal's academy from her teenage years, learning discipline inside a program built entirely around it. She has beaten major champions. She has reached the second week of a Grand Slam. And yet, for her entire career up to now, one nagging asterisk has followed every single accomplishment. She had never won a WTA Tour title. Not one. She came agonizingly close, a tour-level final in Eastbourne in 2025, 2 points from the trophy, and it slipped away. That became the pattern that trailed her name. A spectacular ceiling paired with an uncertain floor. The kind of player capable of beating absolutely anyone on a great day and losing to almost anyone on a mediocre one. Everyone assumed what she was missing was more power, more experience, more time on tour. Nobody expected the missing piece to arrive disguised as patience. But that is exactly what Washington revealed. Not a louder weapon, but a quieter one. The willingness to lose the ace count and still win. The willingness to lose the winner's column and still win. The willingness, in her own words, to play the match actually happening in front of her rather than chasing the version she wished she was playing. After beating Zheng, she put it simply, saying that mindset had always existed somewhere inside her, but the past year had given her far more evidence to trust it. She explained that she had learned to stay present in every point, to remain patient even when trailing, and to trust that opportunities would eventually present themselves. She described a mindset of being ready for anything and simply extending the set long enough to find her window. Listen to how careful that phrasing is. She is not claiming the nerves have vanished. She is not pretending the pressure has disappeared. She is saying she now has more answers available when that pressure shows up, steadier returns, sharper movement on defense, more patience to grind out the 6th, 7th, or 8th shot of a rally that refuses to end. That is not some overnight personality change. That is evolution, quiet and compounding. The kind you barely notice until it suddenly delivers 2 wins in 2 days over 2 champions who are supposed to be far too good for it to work. And this was not a one-off either. Rewind a few weeks to the grass court season and the same pattern was already forming. Most people simply were not paying close enough attention to catch it. In Berlin, she took down Aryna Sabalenka, one of the smartest, most experienced competitors on the entire tour, someone who almost never hands away matches through carelessness. Sabalenka is a 2-time Australian Open champion, a former world number 1, and a player whose power game has troubled even the most accomplished players on tour. Beating her requires discipline from the very first point to the very last, and Eala delivered exactly that. She absorbed Sabalenka's power, redirected it, and refused to give her any easy points. It was a performance that should have made the tennis world sit up and take notice. She also came back to beat Elena Rybakina after falling behind early again. Rybakina, the 2022 Wimbledon champion, is known for her devastating serve and clean ball striking. She had beaten Eala in their previous meeting, and many expected a similar result. But Eala had other ideas. She fell behind early, as she so often does, but she didn't panic. She stayed patient, found her rhythm, and slowly turned the match around. It was not a story about raw power meeting raw power. It was about survival, absorbing the opening onslaught and simply refusing to let the point end. Then came Wimbledon, centre court, facing Iga Swiatek, a defending champion and one of the most dominant players of her generation. Someone who has ended the confidence of countless opponents in straight sets. Swiatek had won 4 Grand Slams by the age of 22, had a winning percentage on clay that rivaled Rafael Nadal's, and was widely considered the most formidable player in women's tennis. Eala beat her too, in straight sets, becoming the first Filipino player in the Open era to reach the 4th round of a Grand Slam. The tennis world was stunned. The headline screamed miracle and shock of the tournament. But for those who had been watching closely, it wasn't a miracle at all. It was the culmination of years of hard work, patience, and gradual improvement. That result revealed the ceiling everyone already suspected she had. What happened weeks later in Washington revealed something far rarer, something much harder to fake, the floor itself rising to meet that ceiling. Because beating a great champion can happen on one perfect afternoon. Anyone can catch fire for 2 hours. But clawing back from a set and a breakdown against an Olympic gold medalist, then returning less than a day later to erase a 5-1 deficit against a defending champion in a tiebreak in front of a loud and restless crowd, that does not happen off talent alone. That takes something closer to emotional armor. And here is the detail that makes this whole picture even more human. None of this was unfolding in a vacuum. The spotlight on her has been growing almost as fast as the results themselves. The tournament director in Washington openly admitted they made a deliberate push to bring her to the event. Once her participation was locked in, roughly 80% of all ticket inquiries came down to one single question: when is she playing? 80% at a combined event already stacked with established American stars and Grand Slam champions. Her matches produced some of the loudest crowds of the entire week. Philippine flags filled the stands, waved by fans who may never have watched a live tennis match before her, now standing in a stadium thousands of miles from home just to catch a glimpse of her walking out. The energy in the stadium was unlike anything the DC Open had ever experienced. Fans had traveled from New York, Virginia, Maryland, and across the United States. Some had flown in from the Philippines, making the 20-hour journey just to watch her play. They lined the fences during her practice sessions, cheered her on during warm-ups, and created an atmosphere that felt more like a home match than a tournament in the United States. "We are so proud of her," one supporter shouted. "Keep going, Alex," another fan called out. "She is such an inspiration," said a young Filipino supporter, reflecting the emotions shared by thousands of fans who had come to witness what would become one of the most memorable victories of Eala's career. When someone asked her what it feels like to be this popular around the world, she did not answer the question as asked. She turned it around and said the better question was what it feels like to be Filipino. Then she thanked the crowd in Tagalog. That single moment tells you everything about the weight she carries out on that court. She is not just chasing ranking points. She is carrying an entire country's hope into every service game, every tiebreak, every unglamorous rally that never makes a highlight reel. And instead of buckling under that weight the way so many young players do, she seems to be turning it into fuel. It's as if the expectation fuels her rather than burdens her, as if the weight of a nation's dreams gives her wings rather than anchors her to the ground. Even before the tournament began, former US Open champion Andy Roddick had recognized what was happening. "Ealamania is fun," he said on his podcast. "I'm sorry, but when you have watch parties in arenas around your country for a fourth-round match, I'm in." Roddick described Eala's rise as something much bigger than a breakout tennis story. "I don't want to hear anyone say, 'I don't care.' Stop talking about it. No, this is a movement." She is single-handedly creating a movement, bringing in an entirely new section of tennis fans that largely didn't exist just a couple of years ago. His comments reflected what was unfolding before everyone's eyes. Alex Eala was no longer simply winning tennis matches. She was inspiring a generation of fans, introducing millions of Filipinos to the sport, and building a passionate following that was changing the atmosphere wherever she competed. She is single-handedly bringing more fans into tennis in a truly committed and passionate way, Roddick added. Roddick's words were prophetic. The movement surrounding Eala had become impossible to ignore. Everywhere she looked, Filipino supporters filled the stands, creating an atmosphere unlike anything the DC Open had experienced before. And the numbers backed it up. Social media engagement around her matches had skyrocketed. Clips of her comebacks were being shared millions of times. Her Instagram following had grown exponentially. She had become a genuine cultural phenomenon, and the tennis world was starting to take notice. What makes this movement so powerful is the genuine connection that Eala has forged with her fans. She doesn't just represent the Philippines. She embodies the values that Filipinos hold dear: resilience, hard work, family, and the refusal to give up in the face of adversity. Every victory she achieves is celebrated not just as an individual triumph, but as a collective achievement for an entire nation. The Philippine flag has become a familiar sight in the stands at every tournament she plays, and the chants of Alex have become a fixture of her matches. This level of fan engagement is rare in women's tennis, and it speaks to the unique bond that Eala has created with her supporters. So, here is where all of this actually leaves things. The old game plan against Eala used to be straightforward: almost predictable. Sit in, extend the rallies, and wait for the brilliance to run dry. Force her to win the ugly way, then watch her fade the way she always used to. That plan worked often enough to define the first stretch of her career, a run of unforgettable peaks followed by quiet, painful exits. Washington just tore that plan in half, because the question opponents now have to answer is no longer whether Eala can produce one more miracle. She has already answered that repeatedly against champions with far bigger reputations than the two she just beat this week. The real question, the one that should genuinely keep the rest of the tour up at night, is what happens when the miracle does not arrive at all and she wins regardless. Zheng did not have an answer. Fernandez did not have an answer. Sabalenka didn't have an answer. Swiatek didn't have an answer. Nobody on tour has found one yet. And that is what makes this moment so significant. Eala has developed a style of tennis that is almost impossible to disrupt. She doesn't rely on any single weapon that can be neutralized. She doesn't have a glaring weakness that can be exploited. She plays the game on her terms, and her terms are patience, discipline, and mental toughness. There is still one box left unchecked in her career. One trophy that has slipped through her fingers every time she has gotten within reach. She has beaten Olympic champions. She has beaten Grand Slam champions. She has beaten a defending champion on the biggest stage of her season so far. She has still never lifted a WTA Tour title.